Now, just to continue the contextualization of the philosophy of metaReality, basic critical realism consists of transcendental realism, critical naturalism, and the theory of explanatory critique, philosophy of science, philosophy of social science, and intervention in ethics. Dialectical critical realism also includes the first venture into the topic of spirituality, which occurred in my book From East to West, when I called the resulting system Transcendental Dialectical Critical Realism. The philosophy of metaReality is a further development, but it presupposes the previous developments. Now, you remember from last time that dialectical critical realism is a four-level system, MELD, popularly known as MELD, in which we understand being as a non-identity, being a structure, being as difference. And this was the gain of the very beginning of critical realism, because critical realism, as you remember from the first session we had, began with a double argument around ontology. There was an argument for ontology against its reduction to epistemology, which resulted in a critique of what I call the epistemic fallacy, and the differentiation of the intransitive dimension of science and knowledge from the transitive dimension. That was one part of the argument. The other part of the argument was the argument for a new ontology, because I maintained that the attempt to do without ontology in philosophy had been fraudulent and actually masked the generation of an implicit ontology, which was a Humean empiricist one, in which the world was conceived as flat, undifferentiated, and unchanging. And in place of that ontology, I argued for an ontology of structure and difference. The key concept of basic critical realism, in a way, was non-identity, critically. That a being was something else, was not the same as knowledge. That structures and generative mechanisms, causal laws, were not the same as empirical regularities. So this was the main characteristic of the first level of ontology, non-identity, structure, and difference, resulting in a critique of what they called actualism, which was the reduction of the real to the actual and thence to the empirical. The second level of ontology, which was broached in dialectical critical realism, took the giant step of thematizing negativity, absence, and change. I argued the world was not unchanging, and change was irreducible to being. And this took the form of a critique of the doctrine of ontological monovalence and the generation of an analysis of change and negativity in terms of the key concept of absence. The third level thematized relations between things as internal as well as extensional, and so took things together as a whole. So we have at this third level as being and understanding being concepts of holistic causality, totality, the concrete universal, constellationality, and many other interesting concepts. Then at the first level of understanding being, we understand it as incorporating human agency and transformative practices. And this is a level that had already been broached in the philosophy of social science, critical naturalism. Now, philosophy of metaReality develops our understanding of three other categorical levels. The fifth level thematizes being as interior, as reflexive, and being as, in a certain sense, spiritual. The sixth sense and the fifth sense is, we talk about 5A, the fifth aspect. Then the sixth level is the level of 6R, the sixth realm, in which we understand being as re-enchanted. We understand meanings and values as real, and not just subjective impositions of human beings, so that the world contains value, whether human beings are here or not, to recognize it. And then the seventh level, which completes the system, understands being in terms of the primacy of identity over difference and the primacy of unity over split. And these three levels are the levels thematized by the philosophy of metaReality. Now, the seventh level is very interesting because in a way what it does is it reverses the standpoint of the first level. At the first level we stress the non-identity between things and categories. The concept that comes very much to the fore is difference. At the seventh level, we assert the primacy of identity, after all, over difference. Now, one paradigm of this might be two people in conversation, totally absorbed in what the other is saying, so that when you're talking, I'm totally focused and listening to you. And then our consciousnesses are in transcendental identification. Although our bodies and our beings remain distinct, so are still in what we characterize as the world of duality, the world of subject and object, our consciousnesses are united. Now, this sense in which the opposition between subject and object is transcended at the level of the philosophy of metaReality doesn't involve the transcendence of or the abolition of the physical world of duality. That still remains. Secondly, we have to understand the sense in which we talk about the primacy of identity. The sense of identity here is very different from the punctiform atomistic identities critiqued in Transcendental Realism. The sense of identity here is like the identity one might feel with a symphony. or with a beautiful picture, or with a sunset. It's a differentiated, developing identity, a moving identity. Still, some argument would have to be given for asserting anything like the primacy of identity over difference in the sort of world in which we live. So let me start with some low-level arguments from our ordinary uses of concepts. So if I say that I and Donald are of different heights, then this presupposes that we have something in common, namely height. If we move from the primacy of identity over difference to the primacy of unity over split, you might want to think about how we could accommodate understanding of a different universe, other than by incorporating its incorporation effectively into our universe, or our universe's incorporation into its universe, so that we were dealing with a mega universe or something like that. It seems difficult to theorize, to understand something outside the universe. When we come into contact with it, it would always be in our universe, in some sense. So these are suggestive arguments. I want to look at a stronger sort of argument from the history of philosophy in a moment. But let me differentiate three characteristic philosophies. There is critical realism, as it's been established up to the philosophy of metaReality, which I think is the best possible way of understanding what happens in the world of duality. And then there is the philosophy of metaReality, which argues there is a world of non-duality, of the transcendence of those dualities, sustaining the world of duality. And then there's a third type of philosophy corresponding to a third kind of world, which we call demi-reality. This is the world of duality in which the differences between things are sharpened into antagonistic contradictions and horrendous splits. And one could certainly argue that we live in a world of duality which is dominated by demi-reality, in which oppressive structures hold sway. The argument of meta-reality would be that these structures couldn't hold sway without being tacitly presupposed by a deeper level, which is in fact a level of non-duality. And once we recognize this level, this gives us an indication of an alternative a source of power in being. So that's where we're heading. Now, let's look at a philosopher who was trying to head in a similar direction, not the same direction, but a similar direction, Hegel. And I'm going to talk about a passage in Hegel from arguably his greatest work, The Phenomenology of Mind, quite a famous passage, which is known as the life and death struggle. Hegel asks us to imagine two primitive beings, let's call them men, savages, who are engaged in a fight to the death. And as one gains victory over the other and stands over the other, Hegel asks the question, why does the winner spare the life of the one who loses? And Hegel's answer is that he spares the life of the loser in order that the loser can praise the winner, can say how marvelous he was, can act as a witness to his bravery and valor and courage in struggle, and in short, in order that the winner's victory and the powers that made it possible are recognized. And this starts a long tradition in the history of philosophy, which takes as its theme the struggle for recognition. And now there's an alternative interpretation of the life and death struggle, which comes from the materialist direction of Feuerbach and Marx. And they say that's rubbish. The reason why the winner spares the life of the person he vanquishes is in order to make the person a slave, in order to make him a servant, and do labor for him. And this itself sets up an alternative dialectic of interpretation, because then we have the whole question of what happens to the slave? Well, the slave, in acting for the lazy master, develops his powers, his or her powers, and eventually it reaches a point when the slave can overthrow the master, and even more importantly, overthrow the master-slave relationship. And so that develops in the history of the left as a struggle for emancipation. And we have these two themes: a struggle for recognition, the struggle to transcend master-slave oppression, as powerful themes still very much present in contemporary political philosophy. What Hegel is doing in his analysis, and the left are doing in their analysis, is presuming that there are arguments why a unity of the sort should be sustained. Now, I want to develop the arguments for the philosophy of metaReality more formally. And my argument is that there are three senses in which identity is prior to, more important ontologically than difference, and unity more important than alienation or split. And the first sense is the sense in which identity or non-duality is necessary for the constitution of social life, necessary for its reproduction or transformation. So we got identity as a mode of constitution. The second sense is one in which identity is the basis of social life. And the third sense is one in which identity, or non-duality, is the deep interior of social being, and indeed of being itself. So, first, looking at the arguments as to why identity is important in the constitution of social life, I want to differentiate 4 forms of transcendence of duality. The first is transcendental identification in consciousness. I'll list them first. Transcendental identification in consciousness, transcendental agency, transcendental holism, and the transcendental self. So, what is transcendental identification in consciousness? This is what happens when you're reading a book or looking at the television, and you're completely absorbed in the book or on the television, and someone comes into the room and says something, and you lose your place in the book, or you lose the developing plot, and you need to ask someone else, well, what happened? Or you go back and you read the paragraph you were on, perhaps it's a philosophy book, and resume the thread of the argument. So metaReality argues that a transcendental identification in consciousness is necessary for any social interaction or any perception to take place. And you might think this is absurd. And you might be listening to me talking now, and you say, well, I'm not in identity with your consciousness, I'm not in identity with your words, I don't agree with them to the extent I can understand them, and that's I can't really understand them. And so how can you talk about transcendental identification in consciousness? If I say I can't understand what you say, and I would say, yes, but you were in identification with the words or the sounds that I made in order to say, to come and tell me that you don't understand them. You have to be in identification with them. You have to be able to say what they are. And so, really, transcendental identification in consciousness of the thought that you have when you're reading a newspaper or looking at television is a very simple and common thing. It is logically the same sort of thing that has been traditionally theorized under the topic of non-duality in religious contexts. The idea of much meditation is to reach a point where there are not two things, there's just one thing, and that is the transcendental consciousness that you're aiming for, whether it's Eastern type meditation or Western type prayer. This paradigm has always seemed a very difficult one, probably because the object that you're being enjoined to become one with is difficult, not because the procedure itself is. there are many jokes that could be told about this kind of state of non-duality. Thus, it's typical for someone leading a meditation group, after he's got the people in the group meditating and supposedly in a state of non-duality, to then ask them who is in a state of transcendental consciousness. Put up your hands, he'll say. And of course, say 40 or 50% put up their hands, and he'll immediately dismiss them, because the fact that they responded in that way showed they weren't in a state of non-duality. They were split between what he was saying and what they were supposed to be doing. Another incident can illustrate the traditional context of this. Archbishop Carey, the English Archbishop of Canterbury, was asked by a journalist how long he spent praying. And he said, a typical day, and he said, well, about 50 seconds, 40, 50 seconds if I'm lucky. And it scandalized the journalist and his audience, because they assumed the Archbishop must be praying for 5 or 6 hours a day. But of course, he was trying to pray for 5 or 6 hours, trying to get in that state of non-dual consciousness, and only obtaining it for a very short moment of time. It becomes less mysterious, this idea of non-duality, when we see how routinely we must achieve it in everyday contexts. So let me move on from transcendental identification in consciousness to the idea of transcendental agency. And this is the idea that in any action there must be a point when the thought of the action, the thought of what you're doing, is no longer a distinct thing from your doing it. In fact, all you have is you're doing it. So I can, for example, think about how I'm going to cook dinner tonight, but at some point I have to actually do it. I could think about what sentence I'm going to say next. At some point I just have to do it. And when I do it, then there is no longer the thought and the doing as distinct entities. There is just the doing. And those kind of spontaneous acts, non-dual acts, are called by philosophers basic acts. And they've been thematized in Western analytical philosophy in that sort of way. So again, they're not so completely new to philosophical consciousness. But the theme that unites them with transcendental identification in consciousness, namely the transcendence of duality, has not been brought out. Now, the third kind of act, a third kind of thing, form of transcendence that we're routinely familiar with, is transcendental holism. Transcendental holism occurs when you're listening to a group or an orchestra, and they're playing in complete harmony, in complete unity with each other. Supposing I often cook dinners with Rebecca, and then she may have certain things that she customarily does, and I may have things which I customarily do, and we will appear to be cooking the dinner, and that's our cooking the dinner, as one. And you'll know today that the World Cup is happening in Brazil. So you probably, if you're at all interested, seen examples of players and effortlessly anticipating other players and balls being passed superbly from one part of the field to another, and the passing resulting in a goal or a tremendous save. Examples of transcendental holism. There are other kinds of examples which may be of interest to social science. For example, how come that in a crowded street, when there are so many people on the pavement, there are so few accidents, that we don't bump into each other? How come so seldom when we're having a telephone conversation do we talk over each other? How does turn-taking happen? So these are all examples of transcendental holism. And the fourth example of the transcendental self takes me, for the purposes of this presentation, into the second sense in which identity is prior to difference in social life. It takes me to the theory of the self. And I would start by saying that we all have three ideas of the self. There is the idea of the self as an ego. That is as something distinct and separate from everything else in the world. And that idea of the self as an ego is, I think, a total illusion. It's false, but it's nevertheless the idea that is at the heart of capitalism and capitalistic societies. Then there is the sense of the self as an embodied personality. Now this sense of the self is real. Yeah, you are an embodied personality in a way in which you're not separate from everyone else. But the problem with it is that what counts as yourself varies from context to context. Do you count your pets as part of yourself, or your husband, or wife, or your role as being teacher a part of yourself? When you go for a job interview somewhere else, it probably isn't. If you're a male, is your car, if you have one, a part of yourself? Yeah, probably it is. And then, of course, it's very variable because we grow older, we learn more, we forget some things, and get taller and then shorter through the life cycle. In short, we're dealing with a very relative and a contextually shifting sense of the self. Now there's a third sense of the self, which is a sense of the self which I call our ground state. This is our transcendentally real self. And one can begin to get a grasp of this sense of the self when you have someone like Hume or Nietzsche coming into a room and saying, well, I searched everywhere for myself, and I can assure you that no self exists. And then you turn around to that and say, who is telling me this? Who is it that is telling me this? And that is the transcendental self, which they're presupposing in the very act of denying it. Of course, that is a logically sound point. But can one give a sort of more intuitive a sense of how you have and can contact this sense? Well, it's characteristic perhaps of the postmodern predicament that the idea of a fractured self, that we're split, that when it comes to trying to decide what we want or do, we find there are 5 or 6 or 7 voices in our head. And so people often say to me, well, which is the transcendental self? Those 6 or 7 voices that I'm hearing. And I say to them, the transcendental self is the listener. Okay, there are 6 or 7 voices you're hearing, but there's only one listener, and that's you. And when you get a grip on the idea of the listener, then you have a grip on the idea of an agency which can restore or begin a process of working towards restoring a robust, unitary, integrated self, a self which isn't fractured. More intuitively even, perhaps, you could say that your ground state is you on a good day. It's, when the sun is shining and you're being perfectly charming and generous to everyone. And the world is sort of smiling back at you and confirming you. You on an exceptional day. Or you can think of it being your higher self. What you would do when you were in your higher self. And you have this sense of it being something you can be in or not in. Well, when you're not in your higher self, when you're not in your ground state, of course your ground state is still there. And you're still in it, but you're also in a lot of other things. You're in your sense of ego, or you're in aspects of your embodied personality. Your greed or vanity or jealousy, which is interfering with your ground state and what without them it would do. So this is the sense in which metaReality posits a sense of identity which is a basis for everything else in the social world, our ground states. And in the metaphysics that is developed there, we have a picture of ground state, everyone having a ground state, like everything having a ground state, every being having a ground state, and the ground states of all things lying on and being connected by what I call the cosmic envelope. So we can take a passage from Rumi, the great poet, which expresses this. He says, every forest branch moves differently in the breeze, but as they sway, they connect at the roots. So they connect at their ground states. The third sense in which identity is basic is prior to or more important than difference in social life, relates to the deep interior of social being. It relates to the deep interior of all being, and this is the sense in which mystics have maintained that if you go deeply enough into anything, in that thing, you will find something wonderful, pure bliss, or in the Hindu tradition, Sat Chit Anand. In the Christian tradition, perhaps a wonderful sense of unconditional love. In Buddhist tradition, you might describe this as emptiness, sunyata, or you might describe it as the Buddha nature. So you'd have Buddhist monks meditating on things like dishcloths, stools, rats, and finding in them, in their deep interior, unconditional. You're finding in them the Buddha nature, or something of that sort. And this sense of the deep interior of things is, of course, something that we can invoke and have seen invoked. For example, when Gandhi was leading the struggle for Indian independence against the British, and row after row of Indians were being mowed down by the callous hitting of British troops. He was conjoining them to see to the deep interior of these beings, to see that they were also deep down sources of love and creativity like themselves, and not just their surface form. So this third sense is a sense which really has to be experienced, rather than a sense which can be demonstrated by transcendental philosophical argumentation. Now, the view of the world that metaReality gives is one in which beings in their ground states connected in a cosmic envelope at a very deep level of analysis sustain a more superficial world of non-duality in which differences arise. And in this world of duality, in particular historical epochs or particular situations and contexts, categorical error, such as is exemplified by the ego, the idea that you can be separate and distinct from every other person, hold sway. Now, metaReality posits three main mechanisms of identification, making oneself one with another, something else, in the world of duality. The first is reciprocity. So if I smile at you, then you smile back at me. That's reciprocity. The second is transcendental identification in consciousness. When I am totally absorbed in what you're saying, or vice versa. And the third is the most radical. It's called co-presence. And that's when I come to see that you're actually not distinct from me. You are not merely something which I have reciprocal relations with, not something which I can identify with transcendentally, but actually are a part of me, that you are in me. And this is called co-presence. And of course, it provides very strong arguments for not harming or hurting the other, because in hurting the other, you're actually hurting or harming a part of yourself. And at the same time, if you want to be free, then you want all to be free, because all are co-present within you. Now, the philosophy of metaReality has some very radical implications, which extend the dialectic of freedom in dialectical critical realism. Because if you have elements in your embodied personality which are inconsistent with your ground state, then your intentionality will be split. If you have an ego which is there, or if you have jealousy or prejudices which are there, which are inconsistent with your ground state, then you won't be able to achieve your objectives in life. And according to this way of looking at things, there isn't anything you can achieve other than self-realization, which means coming into unity with your ground state. And that's the only thing you can feasibly, the only objective you can feasibly have in life. And that provides a sort of ideal of negative freedom. And when you're in your ground state, you can realize that your objectives, some of them without inconsistency. Your intentionality is not split. However, you may have objectives, and your ground state will certainly have objectives, being present with all the other ground states, to end poverty in the world. And then, of course, you can't just do it by working on yourself. What you'll have to do is you'll have to work on all four planes of social being. But now you'll be working as a negatively free, most efficient agent of transformative change to produce the state of eudaimonia, which was the goal of DCR, dialectical critical realism. And let's remember how some of the ways we characterize this goal. Well, one of the ways was in terms of the sublime formula that the eudaimonistic society is one in which the free development, the free flourishing of each, is a condition of the free flourishing of all. And what this means is that Rebecca's flourishing, or Donald's free flourishing, is as important to me as my own. And what that involves is not having an ego. That involves not having a sense of my interests separate and different from Donald's. And of course, we are so far removed from this goal, most of us, and in most of our moments, living moments. But that is the goal that Marx formulated in his vision of a communist society. And that is the goal that Mahayana Buddhists formulate as the goal which is necessary for true enlightenment. It's not just your own realization. It has to be the realization of all. Now, before I end, I want to comment on, or just state something about the ground state qualities, so you have a sense of them. Well, what are the properties of the ground state? We know that the ego or jealousy or prejudice, aren't them, but what are they then? Well, corresponding to the Mao scheme of 1M to 4D, we have characteristically different kinds of qualities. So at 1M, it's will, consciousness, energy. 2E, it's creativity, and everything that arises from and is associated from it. At 3L, it's love. At 4D, it is spontaneous right action. And then at 5A, just to extend it a bit, it would be seeing your intentionality reflected in the world. So this would be successful, reflected praxis. So that will give you a sense of the qualities of the ground state. Then the last topic I want to look at before we break for a few minutes is the extension to social ontology that the identification of this realm makes possible. When you look at the world through the prism of metaReality and allow yourself to identify and recognize non-dual states, then you see that commercial transactions of any sort presuppose a deeper level of trust and solidarity. So if I go up to Gary and ask Gary, I suppose he's a news agent, ask him for a copy of The Guardian, and I don't make any effort to go to a wallet or a pocket, then he may be suspicious that I'm not going to pay him for The Guardian, and refrain from handing over or making to hand over a newspaper to me. And that, in fact, little parable is the form of all commercial transactions. All commercial transactions presuppose something like, in fact, the development of the golden rule: do unto others as you would be done by. In fact, the way they presuppose it really, in most cases, involve a development of it to what's been called the platinum rule, because I'm not trying to do unto Gary what I would be done by, but do unto him what he would be done by, and more especially what his ground state, I would argue, would be done by. Perhaps you shouldn't introduce the ground state there for just routine commercial transactions as embodied personality, but as an ethical ideal, we would have the ground state there. So one gets a vision of social life as at the world of duality as actually sustained by a substratum, a metareal substratum. Let me give you some other glimpses of it, which would be obvious to you when I say them. The world of commercial transactions, again, sustained by domestic labor. And in the realm of domestic labor, we don't have instrumental action with our children. We don't have a contract or exchange relations. What we have, or what we try and have, is unconditional love. Then again, if you look at social activities such as war, through the prism of metaReality, you begin to see that war could not happen without a whole lot of peace going on. That the combat between the soldiers at the front presupposes peaceful activities of getting our supplies to the soldiers, the mobilization of a consciousness around the idea of a war, the support of their sisters and wives at home. A whole lot of peaceful things that have to happen for war to be possible. metaReality is sort of deepening our perspectives in social ontology, because we don't normally notice these things. And creative philosophy here is acting as an under-laborer and identifying resources that can be used to produce a better world eventually. Because there's a huge asymmetry here. If we take the couple of peace and war, we can have a society without war, a society with all peace. But we can't, I'm arguing, have a society which is all war, that is war without peace. So there's an ontological argument that the metareal level is deeper and sustains, and there's a necessary condition for the level that we normally notice. Now, if we have a break now, then we'll return to look at some of the applications and some of the implications of the philosophy of metaReality. Thank you.